On your darkest days, have you ever felt burned by hope? Maybe you felt painfully misled by some attractive expectation, betrayed by some desperate wish that never came true. Perhaps you've been in the opposite boat too. Maybe you've needed hope almost as much as you've needed air, but you couldn't scrape it up, no matter how much you would have liked to. I'm PJ Aubrey, mental health advocate and your host of A Survivor's Guide to Hell, the podcast where we help you manage your mental health so it doesn't manage you. Hope plays a massive role in mental health. That's why we're focusing on it today and answering a few difficult questions like, can hope actually be bad for your mental health? And what can you do if the outlook is so bleak, it seems there's no reason left for hoping? To answer these questions, we're going to turn to one of the most profound figures in hope, Admiral James B. Stockdale, right as his plane was going down over Vietnam. A brief warning, this episode does reference violent war crimes as well as themes of suicide. September 9th, 1965. James B. Stockdale was flying over the lush canopy of North Vietnam. He piloted an A-4 Skyhawk, a small, quick plane which was now flying at 500 knots above the rich green treetops. Little did he know, a Vietnamese flak trap, a hidden anti-aircraft weapon manned by Viet Cong guerrillas, was hidden behind the leaves, tracking him in the sky. There was an explosion, and Stockdale's plane lit like a firework. He pushed and pulled on the A-4's joystick, but it was useless. The control system had been shot out. There was nothing left but to eject and descend helplessly over one of the most dangerous areas in the world, especially for an American Navy pilot. Stockdale would write about that little capsule of time between ejecting from the plane and contacting the ground.
After ejection, I had about 30 seconds to make my last statement in freedom before I landed in the main street of a little village right ahead. And so help me, I whispered to myself, 5 years down there, at least.
The enemy was waiting for him. As soon as he touched the ground, the Viet Cong descended on him like vultures on a wounded animal. A merciless beating ensued.
After the gang tackling and pummeling was over, it lasted for 2 or 3 minutes before a man with a pith helmet got there to blow his police whistle. I had a very badly broken leg that I felt sure would be with me for life. My hunch turned out to be right.
James Stockdale was about to become a prisoner of war in the Hanoi Hilton, a POW camp infamous for a laundry list of tortuous practices. Stockdale would describe his experience there as a laboratory of human behavior. You see, Stockdale was a Stoic. Previous to his time in Vietnam, Stockdale had studied philosophy at Stanford University. He was drawn to Stoic philosophers like Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca, men of towering intellectual stature who advocated principles of personal responsibility, extreme resilience, and acceptance of suffering. Now, with his newfound prison laboratory, Stockdale would put these Stoic principles to the test. The results he carried, limping and emaciated, from the Hanoi Hilton, would teach the world a thing or two about the true nature of hope. Oh my gosh, I'm interrupting your listening experience. How rude. I'm so sorry. I just needed a moment to ask you something. Do you get any value from this podcast? If you do, please help us with our mission to increase worldwide mental health by sharing our podcast. Word of mouth, social media, a sheepish reference to a disgruntled coworker. It all helps. We are not done with the James Stockdale story quite yet, but before we move further, we want to have a real chat with you. A chat about hope. What is hope anyway? Well, it depends on who you ask and what context you're asking in. If you ask a Christian right after church, they'll probably say it has something to do with Jesus, Or if you ask a kid on Halloween, they'll probably say something about quantity and quality of candy, that is. If you talk to someone holding a lottery ticket, they'll probably tell you to hope is to want something really, really badly. All of these definitions have their own merit, but they're not quite what we're talking about in this episode. For our purposes, let's turn to dictionary.com's definition, which is to look forward to with desire and reasonable confidence. In other words, to want something and to think there's a decent chance that you'll actually get what you want. I hope this podcast episode will get more listeners than my last episode. You hope that the rest of your day will be a good day. This version of hope is really important when we're talking about mental health, because in our toughest moments, this brand of hope can easily lift us up into a more balanced mental state. But it can also do the opposite. When our hope is misplaced, it can give us temporary relief only to obliterate our brain's well-being when our expectations aren't met. So how do we know what the right kind of hope is? Is it even possible to know when hope is misplaced? And how can we maintain a healthy hope that doesn't betray us if our most grabbing desires aren't fulfilled? We're going to spend the rest of the episode answering these questions, and we're going to start with something called the Stockdale paradox. Now, if I had to rename this podcast, I'd probably call it the Stockdale Paradox Podcast. Why? Because the idea this paradox describes is so damn powerful. Here it is. The Stockdale Paradox teaches us that one should acknowledge the brutal facts of reality without ever losing faith that one will prevail in the end. Let me put that to you in different words just to help it sink in. This paradox encourages us to face even the cruelest facts of our situation. Burying the harsh facts in the name of positivity is a bad idea. However, we can and should be positive that we will prevail in the end. Perhaps the simplest way to describe the Stockdale paradox is this: understand that your situation is tough, but you are tougher. This paradox changed my life before I even knew it had a name, but that's a story for another episode. The paradox still leaves us with a few questions. What does it mean that we'll prevail in the end? How can we know that we are tougher than the situation before us? For that, we're going to have to revisit Stockdale himself, right in the heart of the Hanoi Hilton.
As an insider, I knew the whole setup, that the North Vietnamese already held about 25 prisoners, probably in Hanoi, and as I was the only wing commander to survive an ejection, that I would be their senior, their commanding officer, and would remain so, very likely, throughout this war that I felt sure would last at least another 5 years. And here I was, starting off crippled and flat on my back. The key word for all of us at first was fragility. Each of us, before we were ever in shouting distance of another American, was made to take the ropes.
Let's pause here. In Stockdale's accounts, he mentions the ropes frequently. See, the Viet Cong would often torture their prisoners by tying them in injuriously painful positions. They were also known to bind the limbs of their captives and then pull those limbs out of socket, causing excruciating pain. And then there was the use of ropes to asphyxiate victims. Here's how Stockdale describes the effects of taking the ropes.
That was a real shock to our systems. And as with all shocks, its impact on our inner selves was a lot more impressive and lasting and important than to our limbs and torsos. These were the sessions where we were taken down to submission and made to blurt out distasteful confessions of guilt and American complicity into antique tape recorders, and then to be put in what I call cold soak. 6 or 8 weeks of total isolation to contemplate our crimes. What we actually contemplated was what even the most self-satisfied American saw as his betrayal of himself and everything he stood for. It was there that I learned what stoic harm meant. A shoulder broken, a bone in my back broken, and a leg broken twice were peanuts by comparison. Epictetus said, "Look not for any greater harm than this, destroying the trustworthy, self-respecting, well-behaved man within you."
As we mentioned earlier, Stockdale was something of a Stoic, and he often quoted this Epictetus, who was a famous Stoic philosopher from ancient Rome. Here, Epictetus was trying to say that there is no greater harm than to destroy what is trustworthy and self-respecting within ourselves. In other words, broken bones mean nothing compared to broken integrity.
When put into a regular cell block, hardly an American came out of that without responding something like this when first whispered to by a fellow prisoner next door. "You don't want to talk to me. I am a traitor." And because we were equally fragile, it seemed to catch on that we all replied something like this. "Listen, pal, there are no virgins in here. You should have heard the kind of statement I made. Snap out of it. We're all in this together. What's your name? Tell me about yourself." To hear that last was, for most new prisoners just out of initial shakedown and cold soak, a turning point in their lives.
Being senior, it was up to Stockdale to take command of the captive Americans, to be an authoritative voice, even as a prisoner of war. The problem? Prisoners were often kept in solitary confinement. Movements were highly monitored, communication highly restricted. How was he to lead his band of prisoners? I'm sure it wasn't easy. But they had a system. Clandestine taps on the wall, crudely fashioned notes hidden in the least suspect places, a rusty piece of wire turned one way or another to send a signal to a fellow prisoner. The extreme isolation created by the Viet Cong had generated an even more extreme creativity in the prisoners. It could often take weeks to send messages this way, but they were able to give and receive commands nonetheless. For example, Stockdale might issue an order for the other prisoners not to comply with a certain demand from their captors. He might direct his comrades to participate in a certain bluff. Stockdale describes the attitude of his compatriots like so.
"We are in a spot like we've never been in before. But we deserve to maintain our self-respect, to have the feeling we are fighting back. We can't refuse to do every degrading thing they demand of us, but it's up to you, boss, to pick out the things we must all refuse to do, unless and until they put us through the ropes again. We deserve to sleep at night. We at least deserve to have the satisfaction that we are hewing to our leader's orders. Give us the list. What are we to take torture for?"
He continues with another description of life in Hanoi Hilton.
Prison life became a crazy mixture of an old regime and a new one. The old was the political prison routine, mainly for dissenters and domestic enemies of the state. It was designed and run by old-fashioned third world communists of the Ho Chi Minh cut. It revolved around the idea of repentance for crimes of antisocial behavior. American prisoners, street criminals, and domestic political enemies of the state were all in the same prison. We never saw a POW camp like in the movies. The communist jail was part psychiatric clinic and part reform school. North Vietnamese protocol called for making all their inmates demonstrate shame, bowing to all guards, heads low, never looking at the sky. It meant frequent sessions with your interrogator, if for no other reason than to check your attitude. And if judged wrong, then you were maybe down the torture chute of confession of guilt, of apology, and then the inevitable payoff, the atonement.
Between the street criminals and traitors, the American prisoners had a special role for the Viet Cong. They were to become cogs in the propaganda machine, tortured into making statements designed to ruin the image of the United States. But as Stockdale tells us, the attempt at the falsified propaganda began to backfire.
Smart American college men were salting their acts with double-meaning sentences, gestures read as funny, obscene by Western audiences, and practical jokes. One of my best friends, tortured to give names of pilots he knew who had turned in their wings in opposition to the war, said there were only two, Lieutenants Clark Kent and Ben Casey. That went on the front page of the San Diego Union, and somebody sent a copy back to the government in Hanoi.
In case you didn't know, Ben Casey was a celebrity from the 60s, and of course, Clark Kent is Superman's famous alter ego. For giving these names, Nels Tanner, Stockdale's friend, was made to endure 3 successive days of rope torture, then had his legs trapped in stocks for 123 days, in isolation. I imagine that the topic of hope was frequently on the inmates' minds, whether they knew it or not. Tortured, isolated in 3x9 cells, with no windows and a light bulb that never turned off. Denied medical care and proper food, surrounded by men determined to break their spirit. What to hope and how long to hope for it? Even if indirectly, those questions must have been present in those dim-lit cells, those rope sessions. Hanoi Hilton was a refiner's fire, where the Stockdale paradox was being forged with unrelenting heat. With each act of defiance, each act of personal will, the prisoners repeated to their captors, "You've made a hell for us, but we are tougher than hell." Much time had passed since that fateful day that Stockdale had been shot out of the sky. He had now been in the Hanoi Hilton for 7 years, and as he put it,
Then I got back into trouble.
Stockdale says he could handle torture sessions without divulging critical information, as long as his captors did not know how much he knew. It was one thing to try and force information from someone who might not have it. Another thing entirely to press the facts from someone who knew them without a doubt. So when captors had discovered a note authored by Stockdale, he knew he was in for it. The note implied that Stockdale knew something about his friends and their, quote, black activities, as the Viet Cong called it. With this note empowering his captors, Stockdale knew he'd be tortured to a breaking point, and that the information they'd force from him would imperil his comrades, not only to be injured, but tortured to death.
This note would open doors that could lead to more people getting killed in there. We had lost a few in big purges, I think in torture overshoots, and I was getting tired of it. It was in the fall of 1969. I was solo in the main torture room in an isolated part of the prison the night before what they told me would be my day to spill my guts. There was an eerie mood in the prison. Ho Chi Minh had just died, and special dirge music was in the air. I was to sit up all night in traveling irons. My chair was near the only pane glass window in the prison. I was able to waddle over and break the window stealthily. I went after my wrist arteries with the big shards. I had knocked the light out.
Knocked the light out. Stockdale had managed to cut himself deep enough to fall unconscious in his own blood. Wait a second, you might be thinking, this guy tried to kill himself? What happened to the triumph of his human will? What happened to the Stockdale paradox? If you ask me, his human will was alive and well. Perhaps he met the idea of suicide with dread, or perhaps the idea gave him relief. In the end, it doesn't really matter how he felt about it. He didn't choose death because he had succumbed to his captor's cruelty. He chose death to defy his captor's cruelty. He wouldn't allow the Viet Cong to get the information he was hiding. He wouldn't allow his comrades to be incriminated in something that could get them killed. He was going to break the rules one more time. one last ultimate act of free will before he checked out of his mortal existence. He hadn't lost hope that he'd triumph over all the brutality. In fact, he was doing everything in his power to ensure that he would triumph, even if it meant his own mortal demise. However, Stockdale's story is far from over.
The patrol guard happened to find me passed out in a pool of blood, but still breathing. The Vietnamese went to general quarters, got their doctor, and saved me. Why? It was not until after I was released years later that I learned that very week, my wife Sybil was in Paris demanding humane treatment for prisoners. She was on world news, a public figure, and the last thing the North Vietnamese needed was me dead. There was a very solemn crowd of senior North Vietnamese officers in that room as I was revived. Prison torture, as we had known it in Hanoi, ended for everybody that night. All I knew at the time was that in the morning, after my arms had been dressed and bandaged, the commissar himself brought in a hot cup of sweet tea, told my surveillance guard to take off my leg irons, and asked me to sit at the table with him. Why did you do this? You know I sit with the Army's general staff. They've asked for a full report this morning. It was not unusual for us to talk like that by that time, but he never once mentioned the note, nor did anybody else thereafter. That was unprecedented. After a couple of months in a tiny isolated cell we called Calcutta to let my arms heal, they blindfolded me and walked me right into the Las Vegas cell block. The isolation and special surveillance were over. I was put, solo of course, in the Mint. Dave Hatcher knew I was back because I walked under his window, and though he could not peek out, he could listen. And over the years, he had attuned his ear to my walking signature, my limping gait. Soon enough, the rusty wire over the sink in the washroom was bent to the north. Dave Hatcher's signal for note in the bottle under the sink for Stockdale. Like an old fighter pilot, I checked my 6 o'clock, scooped the note up fast, and concealed it in my prison pajama pants carefully. Back in my cell, after the guard locked the door, I sat on my toilet bucket, where I could stealthily jettison the note if the peephole cover moved, and unfolded Hatcher's sheet of low-grade paper toweling on which he had printed with rat dropping the last verse of Ernest Henley's poem, Invictus. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishment the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul.
In this verse that Stockdale just quoted, the word gate is spelled G-A-T-E, as in garden gate. But thinking of Stockdale limping, alive, and victorious across the Hanoi Hilton grounds, I think of the other form of the word gait, the form that refers to the rhythm with which you walk, G-A-I-T. Stockdale had a broken gait, stuttering, crooked, but it matters not how straight the gate. In fact, remember that Stoic philosopher that keeps coming up, Epictetus? He was a captive himself once, a slave. His master had broken his leg in a severe beating. Both Epictetus and James Stockdale would live the rest of their lives with a limp. But they were free men, free in their souls long before they were free from their captors. James Stockdale was released on February 12, 1973, during Operation Homecoming. He had been tortured and isolated in the Hanoi Hilton for over 7 years. He was reunited with his wife and 4 sons 2 days after his release. So, what does Stockdale and his paradox teach us about hope? Let's change the scene now, rather than rat-littered cells and blood-stained torture chambers. Let's take a seat in a clean, welcoming office in Stanford University, where author Jim Collins is preparing for an interview with Stockdale himself by reading his memoir. "Here I am, sitting in my warm and comfortable office," Collins says, "looking out over the beautiful Stanford campus on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. I'm getting depressed reading this, and I know the end of the story. I know how Stockdale gets out, reunites with his family, becomes a national hero, and gets to spend the later years of his life studying philosophy on this same beautiful campus. If it feels depressing to me, how on earth did he deal with it when he was actually there and did not know the end of the story?" Collins and Stockdale would end up walking to lunch together on a beautiful, comfortable day. On this walk, Stockdale told Collins,
"I never lost faith in the end of the story."
Collins writes, "I didn't say anything for many minutes, and we continued the slow walk toward the faculty club. Stockdale limping and arc-swinging his stiff leg that had never fully recovered from repeated torture. Finally, after about 100 meters of silence, I asked, 'Who didn't make it out?'
"Oh, that's easy. The optimists."
"The optimists? I don't understand," I said, now completely confused.
"The optimists. Oh, they were the ones who said, 'We're going to be out by Christmas,' and Christmas would come, and Christmas would go. Then they'd say, 'We're going to be out by Easter,' and Easter would come, and Easter would go, and then Thanksgiving, and then it would be Christmas again. And they died of a broken heart."
Another long pause and more walking. Then he turned to me and said,
"You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be."
That was the end of the excerpt from Jim Collins' book. Thanks to Stockdale, I see that there are basically 3 categories of hope. There's no hope at all. This would categorize the prisoners that had not only lost faith in their release, but had lost faith in themselves. The kind of faith Stockdale said you can never afford to lose. These prisoners were successfully broken. Then there's the next category, false hope. Stockdale described this when he spoke of the men constantly swearing to themselves, "We'll be out by Christmas. We'll be out by Easter." These men pegged their expectations on an outcome completely out of their control. Like a lottery player, they were setting themselves up for only the slightest chance of relief and a much bigger chance of crushing disappointment. Remember, Stockdale described these men as the ones who wouldn't make it. Then there's the last category of hope, the Stockdale paradox category. Those who placed their hope in their own perseverance, knowing full well that everything else was out of their control. Those who wouldn't ignore life's cruelties. And they carried on anyway. What category of hope do you fall into? When the suffering comes, where do you direct your heart? Hopelessness? False hope? Or hope in your own triumph? I think most of us have visited each of these categories at least once, but this is my invitation to you. The next time you feel yourself suffering, be more deliberate about the kind of hope you choose. It could very well determine the kind of person you will become once you've reached the other side of your pain. And believe me, the other side will come, in one form or another. It always does. Guys, we've made it to the end of today's episode, and it's time for the Silver Liners Challenge. As always, this challenge is designed to be an actionable task that will help you take control of your mental health, so your mental health takes less control of you. This particular challenge might sound a bit cheesy, but I dare you to try it anyway. The next time you encounter a difficult situation, try the Stockdale paradox. Remind yourself that this situation is tough, but you are tougher. We'll follow up with how you did in our next episode. For now, we'd like to thank James Stockdale and all those who suffered in the name of our freedom. Stockdale passed away in July of 2005. And what a legacy he left. If you'd like to read the document from which we sourced most of our story, you'll find a link in the episode description. We would also like to thank Jim Collins and his book, Good to Great, where the term Stockdale Paradox was coined. We'll also include a link to his book in the show notes. Finally, please note that AI was used in today's episode to help craft Stockdale's voice. In a moment, we're going to give you our cheesy joke of the week, but first, a little reminder, if you think today's message had any value, please help us share it through word of mouth, social media, or whatever works for you. Our goal is to improve global mental health, and we couldn't do it without you. Without further ado, our cheesy joke of the week. This joke features one of the biggest false hope magnets in the world, the lottery. A traveler passes by a farm and sees a sign that says, "Talking dog for sale, $20. Curious to see a talking dog, the traveler stops and asks the farmer if the dog really speaks. The farmer says, "Go ask him yourself." So the traveler finds the dog sunbathing nearby and asks him, "How did you learn to talk?" The dog replies, "I'm not really sure how I learned to talk. My former master won the lottery. After that, we traveled the world together, mingled with cultured folks, ate in the finest restaurants, enjoyed the arts, as well as luxury vacations. My owners splurged on me with high-end groomers and chefs, and had me trained by the world's best dog trainers. I learned French and Russian, and how to play a few classical pieces on the piano." The traveler says, "That's incredible!" and then asks the farmer why he would sell such an incredible dog for a mere $20. The farmer says, "Because he's a liar. He didn't do any of that stuff." That's it for now, guys. Don't forget to join us week after next. Until then.